look great." I grinned in response. "And as a reward, you'll let me skip Howard." I sighed as theatrically as I could manage. "Yes, dear." Humming the Volga boatman's song, I picked up my suit jacket. Bridget said nothing, but the glare was communication enough. The maitre d' led us to the table and pulled out a chair for Bridget. I looked around the table at the two other couples, noting the same hang-dog look on the men's faces that I was pretty sure was on mine. Some things just never changed, centuries or light years away. Bridget smiled and made introductions. Kumar and Rita, Arnie and Sylvie were friends of Bridget's from back in her biologist days. I wondered for a moment if it was odd that I'd never met them. Arnie gazed at me intently, his eyes narrowed. "Honestly, Howard, if I didn't already know you're an android, I wouldn't ever have suspected." Sylvie turned to him, jaw hanging. "Arnie, for crying out loud! What, are we supposed to ignore the elephant in the room? Is this a big secret?" I noted that Kumar was trying to suppress a grin. Rita seemed to be unable to decide who to support. I waved a hand in dismissal and smiled at Sylvie and Arnie. "No, he's right. I don't think I'd be able to take an entire evening of everyone dancing around the topic. Let's get it out of the way." Arnie looked smug and Sylvie glared at him. Before that could escalate, I continued. "And you wouldn't have known until I opened up my abdomen to get rid of my meal." Bridget snorted. Kumar laughed out loud, and Rita finally came down on Sylvie's side. Both women glared at me, then at Bridget. "You two are made for each other," Sylvie said. I looked up at the ceiling. In my case, that's literally true. I sat back in satisfaction as the entire table broke up. Where are these tough crowds I keep hearing about? Arnie, wiping a tear from one eye, said, "You don't actually do that, do you, with the abdomen and—" "No," I grinned back. "But I threaten it fairly often." Bridget has stopped paying attention, so it's nice to have some new victims. The comedy festival had attracted a bit of attention, but now that we were quieting down, the other tables went back to their own business. "So how lifelike are you?" Sylvie's face registered shock as she heard herself. "Oh, God, that came out wrong. I mean—" "It's okay, Sylvie. I'm not that easily offended. We've tried to design the androids to be as realistic as possible, both to us and to other people, which means pain, emotional reactions, reflexes, and so on. It's an ongoing project, of course." "Does that include—" I grinned. "Ongoing project." Bridget rolled her eyes. "Can we order food now?" I smiled at her and signaled the waiter. Once he'd taken our orders, I gazed around the table. Look, I'm human. Or at least I was, once. I grew up in Minnesota, had sisters and parents, went to school, and so on. You wouldn't think anything of someone with a prosthetic arm, right? Just think of me as an extreme amputation case. Bridget choked on her wine and went into a coughing fit. After some emergency back patting and cleanup, I grinned at the others. On the other hand, reflexes like that one I can do without. The rest of the meal passed without significant events. We talked, we laughed, we drank. I made sure to set my alcohol consumption below anyone else. A drinking competition would be blatantly unfair, of course. Still, Kumar put away perhaps one or two too many with the inevitable loosening of lips. As we were sitting back staring at our empty dessert plates, he grinned at me, his head slightly off kilter. "So, any plans to take over the world? You guys could do it, couldn't you? You have the high ground, all the weapons." Rita glared at him, then drew back a clenched fist. I held my hand up to stop her and gave Kumar the stink eye. Why does everyone always want to take over the world? I've never understood that. It sounds like a horrible job. Hell no. We're going to deal with the others, but other than that, you guys are on your own. I'd expressed the sentiment maybe a little more forcefully than intended because eyebrows went up around the table. "Look," I said, trying to smooth things over. "It takes a certain type of person to want to rule. Bob wasn't that type. None of us are. If anything, once this whole others thing blows over, we're more likely to just take off, so no, not a long-term issue. Kumar nodded, and the tension seemed to dissipate, but I was left with an uneasy feeling about my statement. I pulled off the tie and tossed it onto the kitchen table. Free at last! Bridget grinned at me as she set the kettle in preparation for her end-of-day tea. It went well. They seemed to accept you, once the initial awkwardness was taken care of. Did you perhaps prime Arnie to say that? I gave her the evil eye. Not as far as you know. I laughed. Right. So is there a bigger picture? Bridget stared at the kettle for a few moments, perhaps willing it to hurry up. Howard, you and the other Bobs, you're kind of like bears or mountain lions. No complex society, mostly solitary animals. Very little need to interact. And unlike those animals, you're also comfortable with each other. I'm sure having very similar attitudes about most things plays into it, but when it comes to other people, it gets more complicated. I had to disagree about the no complex society comment, although I had a fair idea what she actually meant by it. But how to explain moots, the rules of VR visits, and so on, I decided to let it pass. The kettle clicked, and she was silent for a moment as she poured. What I'd really like is for you to be old news instead of a novelty. Just an extreme amputation case, like you said. People need to see you as just another person. People in general, and some specific people. Ah, yeah, there's that. Okay, Bridget. I've long since learned that you're thinking several steps ahead. I'll go along. Just as long as I don't have to wear the damned tie again. No promises, you have to suffer too. I chuckled and sat with her as she settled down with her tea. While she sipped, I used the time to think about that last exchange with Kumar, and everything that it implied. 15. Enclaves. Riker. April 22-27. Seoul. I watched with satisfaction as the latest colony ships accelerated out of the solar system. The situation had improved a little when the first wave of ships started returning from their trips, ready to take out another load. Now, between new construction and returning transports, we were starting to get some throughput. Still not nearly enough, though. We were coming up on 1 million emigrants. 100 trips down, 1,400 to go. I scanned the report from Charles again. It hadn't magically changed since the first time. Damn. I pinged him. Hey, Charles, just read your report. It's that bad? Hi, Will. Charles popped in as he answered. Yeah, we're having to put more and more drones into scavenging, which is taking equipment away from the construction effort, and we've got printers sitting idle some of the time, waiting for supplies. Right now, productivity is down about 20% from where it could be, and it's going to keep getting worse. I swiped through the report as he talked. No new caches of metals? No, nothing we can find. The problem isn't that there's no metal left in the solar system, it's that there are no convenient concentrations of metal left. Everything accessible was long since mined out by humanity, and the war pulverized or vaporized a lot of the cities and military equipment. Most of the planet-side metal is dust, or rust. We've collected all the space junk that's easy to find. Anything else is probably in weird long-period orbits. I've even got squads of roamers walking in lines along the ground picking up metal scraps. We're really down to the dregs, Will. I rubbed my forehead. We're at, 82 ships? Maybe we reach 100 before it gets too difficult to find any more materials. 40 years per round trip average. That's 2.5 ships per year, so 25,000 people per year. 560 years to finish the job. We've talked before about building colony ships at other stars, Will. It's still an option. Yeah, I know, but there's so much ramp-up required. Plus, you'd have to get a Bob to stay put to supervise. So far, not a lot of takers. Oliver, over in Alpha Centauri, for instance, is concentrating on preparations for an others assault. Like it or not, Seoul is still the best place to build colony ships. Except for the resources issue, of course. We keep going over the numbers. It doesn't get any better with repetition. We can keep the enclaves viable for maybe another 50 to 100 years. And that's with every trick we've been able to come up with. Well, really, I said. We can keep the enclaves going forever. Sure, by going underground or into the ice. Completely subterranean existence, completely dependent on the farm donuts and hydroponics. And on us, because in that position they'd have no industrial base. The bottom line, though, is we'd be telling most of the population that they'll be spending the rest of their lives in a cave. Charles sat back and stared at the ceiling. I looked up and realized that I'd never bothered to put any detail into the ceiling in my VR. It was a flat blue with no texture. I quickly added a popcorn finish and placed a banner that said, "My eyes are down here." Charles let out a surprised, barking laugh. He looked down at me, grinning. "You know, Will, you didn't used to have much of a sense of humor." I smiled sadly back at him. I think I'm trying to keep a bit of Homer alive. Charles lost his own smile and nodded. "We'll miss Homer." I stared into the middle distance, focused on nothing in particular. It wasn't just Homer, Butterworth, Julia Hendricks, and a couple of other members of our extended family had passed away in the last decade. Not people I'd particularly known, except by name, but it reminded me that given enough time, everyone I knew would eventually be gone. After a few moments of contemplative silence, Charles said, "We could stick everyone in stasis." "I've thought about it, Charles. 14 million stasis pods. That's about 30 colony ships worth of materials. Not only would we have to stop building ships, we'd have to cannibalize a dozen of the existing ones. I don't see the UN going for that. In the long term, it would make more sense. People don't think in the long term." "Have you brought it up?" I sighed. "No, and probably due to cowardice. But you're right, they should be allowed to decide. I'll bring it up today." Representative Misra's gaze never wavered as she asked questions. One of the most level-headed of the UN delegates, she never got upset. If I could get her on side, I had a good possibility of pulling this off. "You can build 14 million stasis pods?" "Yes, as I said. We'll have to cannibalize a dozen of the returning colony ships, as well as divert all future construction." "How long to complete all the pods?" "I think around 50 years, mostly due to supply issues." "So many of us will die of old age, regardless. Meanwhile, no new colony ships will go out." "That's true, Representative Misra. But after the first dozen, any returning ships can still take people out." Swarna Misra looked down at her desk for a moment, then looked back at the camera. "Here's the problem, Mr. Johansson. Under the current system, about 300,000 more people will go out to colonies within our lifetimes. Under your proposed system, possibly half of the population, 7 million people, will die of old age on Earth before pods are ready for them. The other half will get into pods where they will remain for some indefinite amount of time, possibly centuries. Mathematically, your suggestion makes some sense, but emotionally, it is not attractive. At least while alive, we are masters of our destiny." Reaching forward, she said, "I cannot endorse this plan. Sorry." She switched off her microphone and sat down. Damn! Next up was Minister McIntyre. He had replaced Gerald in New Zealand after the Vehement situation. He was barely less hostile to me than Gerald had been. Despite several clandestine investigations on my part, I hadn't been able to find any connection that would warrant the antipathy. I guess I would have to accept that I would never be New Zealand's favorite replicant. "What assurances do we have that you'll even wake us up?" he asked, not even bothering with any warm-up remarks. Oh, for crying out loud. "Because if that's how I felt, Minister, I could just leave right now with no subterfuge." "So you are threatening us now?" I rolled my eyes, and I let the cameras see it. The session went on for several hours, and the upshot was that it would be discussed and debated more at future sessions. Meanwhile, we would continue with the current schedule. I sighed and closed my video window. Stupid humans. 16. The Departed. Marcus, March 2215, Poseidon. An angry mob faced off against the security personnel. "You do not have a right to prevent us from leaving," someone yelled. The security squad stood squarely between the citizens and the parked flyers. They weren't quite pointing their weapons at the crowd, but the threat was definitely there. It seemed the council had finally gotten their act together. Within minutes of my announcement that the fourth aerial city, Thark, was taking immigrants, security squads had moved in and cut people off from the flyers. I'd been expecting them to come up with something, eventually, although they seemed to have figured it out a little more slowly than I'd have given them credit for. But that was okay. Time for Phase 2. Behind the crowd, opposite the security forces, a half-dozen cargo drones landed. I floated my observation drone up high enough to be seen and heard clearly, ordered the drones to open the cargo bay doors, and announced, "Buses for Thark are now loading. Please move to the back of the bus." Within seconds, the crowd had loaded into the cargo drones. The security personnel gritted their teeth, and several of them made as if to point their weapons. The squad leader growled an order, and they desisted. I released a breath that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For all my bravado, I knew I was engaged in a game of brinksmanship. If the council decided to call my bluff, people could get hurt or killed, and that would be on me. But we'd now loaded 4 cities without violence breaking out. A precedent of sorts had been established. Very likely I'd be getting a call from Councillor Brennan any minute now. Riker popped into my VR. "I just got an earful from the Poseidon Council. Fomenting revolution, are you?" I bobbed my head back and forth as I waved him to a chair. Riker sat down, accepted a coffee from Jeeves, and gazed at me silently, one eyebrow up. "Come on, Will. You know what they've been doing. Clamping down on travel, use of flyers, dictating jobs, living arrangements. It's a unique situation, Marcus. Poseidon's got all the room you could want, but only if you're a fish." I waved the comment away. "I understand the scarcity situation, but there's no aspect of we're all in this together. They just hand down pronouncements, and you do as told or else. And or else now includes consequences. Anything from loss of privileges through house arrest all the way to incarceration. And if there's anything dumber than jailing people when you need every single person working, I've never seen it." Will sighed. "Okay, bud. Off the record, I agree with you. And I've read your blog about the monitoring, which I find as galling as you do. But the official line from the council is that you're interfering with the development plans for the planet." I rolled my eyes. "Of course I'm interfering. That's the whole point. But," I held up a finger in a lecturing pose, "what I'm not doing is screwing up the timetable. Putting people on aerial cities spreads the population quicker, gets people off the mats quicker, ramps up the technology quicker. A planet full of aerial cities would be the ideal situation. Come to that, we could do the same with the floating cities. But the council is building just enough of them for industrial and commercial purposes, with residential use not even on the priority list. They don't want people out there on dozens of different independent cities, because there's no way to control people in that scenario. I don't know how we managed to end up with a bunch of reactionary types in charge. It sure doesn't go with the stereotype of laid-back tropical islanders. Sharma would never have allowed this to develop." I sighed. "Ephemerals, Will. They die." "Don't let Bill hear you say that." "Yeah, I know." I got up and started to pace. "Look, bottom line, I'm not doing anything in any way illegal or immoral. It's like Howard with his distillery. It pissed off Cranston, but it was a completely reasonable business venture." I turned to Will. "And speaking of, aren't you one of the guys who got Cranston deposed because you didn't like his policies?" Will grinned at me. "I didn't do it. Nobody saw me. And you can't prove it anyway. Whereas I'm a little more obvious about it, but it's the same problem. How do we keep working with a government that we believe is wrong on a basic moral level?" "Okay, Marcus, I've talked to you, which is what the council asked me to do. Will got up and gave me a quick salute. Just don't get anyone killed, all right? Without waiting for a response, he popped out. Yeah, that's the trick, isn't it? Sighing, I pulled up the latest reports. 2 more cities, almost ready to launch. Cal had come up with a bunch of suggestions for the next generation design, based on feedback from early residents. And Thark was full, and in full operation. It was all looking good, but sooner or later the council would decide on a strategy. I couldn't completely suppress a feeling of dread. 17. Underway. Icarus, January 2232, interstellar space. The phrase middle of nowhere took on an entirely new meaning when you were between star systems. I sat in the middle of a sphere of empty space, with nothing more than the occasional lonely hydrogen atom for literally light years. The Orion Cygnus arm of the Milky Way stretched across the sky, annotated by overlays showing distances, readings, and the location of local tourist attractions. 60 trillion miles to next gas station. I snorted at the thought. Status check. I looked up at the call from Day. Right on time as usual. Well, why not? I didn't begrudge him his tics, and he didn't tease me about my wrap-around planetarium view. I returned to my library and opened up my calculation page before responding. Everything's in the green. Your tau is a little low. I glanced at the status board. I was drawing slightly ahead of you. I had to cut back my acceleration just a tad. I would have preferred if you'd extended your curve instead. Ick, we need to be synchronized. Understood. Still lots of time to adjust. And on that subject, how are the calcs going? So-so. I still can't find a definitive answer. Of course, it's not like anyone's ever done this before. Daedalus chuckled. Yeah, granted. Have you determined a safe minimum tau, though? Sure, I answered. But it's probably overkill. I'm good with overkill. I could hear the grin in his voice. As am I, Day, as are all the Bobs. And we have the tau for that, or will by the time we get there, which won't be long on our clocks. I smiled into the air. I guess we could get ourselves into the Bobiverse Book of Records with this. Highest recorded tau by a heaven vessel. Uh-huh. You thinking of heading for the galactic core? That got a chuckle from me. You know, once we're done, assuming this works. Sure, but it's not a terrible idea, really. There was a moment of silence. I was going to laugh at you, Ick. But the more I think of it, really, what's holding us here? Homo Sidereia, baby. Maybe it's time to join up. Daedalus popped in, holding a coffee. Or started up. Even Mario hasn't really left the area. I don't think anyone qualifies yet. I waved up a patio chair for Day, his favorite seating device, and popped up a coffee for myself. You think we're timid as a group? No. Maybe just creatures of habit and comfort zone. I nodded slowly, letting a grin form. So, you up for it? Hell, why not? I raised my cup in salute. To Sagittarius A*, may it not fry us to twigs. Day made a sweeping motion with his hand. Just have to make this delivery first. 18. Arrival at 82 Eridani. Mac. October 2220, 82 Eridani. I was incredibly lucky to have been preparing to go out with a set of colony ships when 82 Eridani was secured. The vote by the colonists to change destinations was barely a formality, probably the most one-sided vote ever registered on Earth, pre- or post-war. And now, 25 years later, we'd arrived. 3 colony ships, 2 from Vancouver Island and 1 from Japan, would be the first human beings to settle this system. The inner of the 2 habitable planets resembled Venus in the old pulp fiction novels. Thick, impenetrable jungle, heavy clouds and mist, and large, hungry animals. The outer planet was cooler with predominantly steppe climates, but it also had about 7% heavier gravity than Earth. The second generation would adapt. The first would have sore feet for the rest of their lives. And the larger moon of the outer planet was habitable. Marginally. It would require a serious beefing up of atmospheric pressure, but thanks to years of research and, frankly, screwing around with the environment on Ragnarok, Bill had solutions ready. We would have the atmosphere up to Earth normal within 50 years. I checked the L4 points for each planet, looking for the materials caches that Vern's notes said he'd left for us. Sure enough, a couple of million tons of various elements, bundled up with radio beacons attached, all ready and available for manufacturing. Awesome. Well, time to report back. I pinged the colony ships, then invited them into my VR. Isaac, Jack, and Owen popped in. This group had no particular VR theme or style, and all three affected simple jean and t-shirt ensembles. Original Bob had always been a bit buttoned down, so it was surprising to see the same variation in three clones at the same time. One of these years, someone would have to do a study and see if there were any patterns to the cloning variations. "Hey, Mac," Isaac said. "How's it looking?" "Well, the stuff Vern left for us is still there. The system appears to still be Medeiros-free, which is a bonus, of course." I arranged holograms and data sheets for the three planets in midair, then turned to the other Bobs. "We need to name the planets. The humans seem to accept suggested names from us, but leave it to them and, well, we're still waiting on KKP. "I thought it was Quilt?" Jack grinned. "It might end up as that just through common usage, but the official name is still KKP, until they can agree on something." Jack waved the comment away, not really interested. "Looking at the pictures, I really like Owen's suggestion of Valhalla for the moon of Planet 3. Can we settle that one?" I looked around. Everyone nodded. "Okay, Valhalla it is," I said. "I agree, that's a good one. Now the primary? Asgard? That's a little trite, don't you think?" I gave Jack the evil eye. He shrugged, unrepentant. "I like themes." No one but me seemed to have a problem with it, so I shrugged. "Let's take it as tentative. Now, Planet 2? Tartarus? Oh, sure, if you don't want anyone to settle there. Ever." Jack grinned and shrugged again. "Well, if we want to stay on theme, there's Muspelheim." "That sounds like some kind of rash," Isaac interjected. We all laughed. "Jotunheim?" We all looked at Owen. "Land of Giants," I said. "Actually kind of appropriate." "And sticking to the theme," Jack exclaimed. "Okay then, vote on those three. In favor? Opposed?" I grinned at the guys. "Carried. Looks like we have a Norse mythology going on here." I sat down and grabbed a Coke. "So now that the fun stuff is out of the way, how will we handle the settling?" "We'll wake up a rep from each colony group, let them decide." Isaac waved a hand at the holograms. "There's enough space on Asgard and Jotunheim that they could reasonably pick the same planet." Jungle planet, heavy planet, or can't breathe planet. This should be fun. Katsu Ito, leader of the Japanese enclave, was a Harvard-educated intellectual who had found himself in a position of power despite all his attempts to dodge the position. Or so he explained it anyway. At the moment, he was hugging a coffee in Exodus 43's common area. I'd printed up one of the androids from Howard's plans and was sitting across the table, waiting for him to focus. He looked up at me, eyes still not quite tracking. Bobbing his head slightly, he said, "You're not a video, but you look like Riker." "What the?" I smiled back at him. "Android, sir. Technology marches on. I'm Mac, the replicant who was assigned to escort the colony ships to 82 Eridani." Christy Campbell, the Vancouver Island Enclave leader, was hugging a cup of chamomile tea. I spared a moment to be perplexed. The stasis pods didn't freeze the subject. There was no reason to be cold or to need to warm up. But when decanted, people almost universally wanted to hug something warm. Weird. She peered at us with one eye, evidently in somewhat worse shape than Katsu. "I think the takeaway, Sir Ito,
is that we have arrived and there are some decisions to make.
That is correct, Sir Campbell. I nodded to her. I've prepared summaries for you to read while you hug your warm-up drinks. We can talk in an hour or so. I nodded again, got up and left. I could have just switched off right in front of them, but I didn't think that shoving my artificiality in their faces would be politically astute. I came back an hour later to find the two colony leaders in deep discussion. They looked up as I sat down. "Have you come to any decisions?" I asked.
I believe we have,
Sir Campbell replied.
The Canadian contingent will settle on Asgard. Your first recommendation for a site will be acceptable.
She turned her head and nodded to Mr. Ito, conceding the floor. He wore a tight smile as he spoke. "We will settle the second planet, and we will accept your recommendation of a more northerly location where the ecosystem is less overwhelming. However, the name..." I raised my eyebrows. "Jotunheim? It sounds like someone sneezing." He shook his head. "Unacceptable. We prefer Takamagahara." I quickly referenced my libraries. It took less than 5 milliseconds to find the definition. The dwelling place of the Kami. Nice. And perhaps appropriate. However, Westerners will shorten it to Takama, just saying. He grinned. "An acceptable risk." "Okay. Done." I returned the smile. "Jack will be pissed. His theme is kaput." Jack popped into my VR, invoked a lazy boy, and plopped down on it. "Ah, friggin' whiny, complainy, ungrateful humans. We hate them." "What now?" "Turns out the jungles of Takama stink. And not just any old stink. The kind of stink that makes you wish you were back on Earth. Oh, and the gravity of Asgard is too high, like that's a surprise, but apparently it's our fault, like we adjusted the gravity meter badly. And the sun is too bright, the clouds are too dark, the bugs are too buggy, the hills are too hilly." "You exaggerate." "Possibly. A bit." Jack sat forward and scrubbed his face with his hands. "Remind me why we're doing this?" "Because we're wonderful, caring people. Speak for yourself." I grinned at him. Actually, Jack, it brings up a point. Dexter's been getting great results on Vulcan and Romulus by concentrating on making the inhabitants as independent as possible. Things like giving them control over the printer groups, making sure they have their own cargo ships, and so on. Maybe we should move in that direction early. Jack shrugged. "That's up to you more than anyone. The three of us will be leaving as soon as we finished offloading the colonists. You're the one who has to put up with them long term." Well, one step at a time. Sir Campbell was not amused. Okay, note to self, no attempts at levity in the future. "Fine, Sir Campbell, exactly what would you like me to do about the mosquitoes?"
Mosquitoes have nothing on these flying vampires, Mr. Johansson. It would be nice if they fell over dead after biting someone, but apparently humans are biocompatible. There must be something that can be done to control them.
Cupid bugs on Vulcan, Ickies on KKP, and super vampire power mosquitoes here. It would appear that the universe had certain themes that it liked to reuse. Wonderful. You understand that if we clear them, there will be ecological impacts.
I really don't care. I have 3 bites myself that are keeping me awake at night, and I can state truthfully that I would happily take a hammer to each and every one of the little pests.
I had to admit, of all the things I didn't miss about being biological, mosquitoes ranked very high. Got it. All right, Sir Campbell, I think I can adapt Howard's Cupid killers for something a little smaller. Sir Campbell nodded, apparently mollified.
I don't suppose you can do anything about the gravity?
She gave me a small smile. Afraid not, I chuckled. Contrary to popular rumor, there isn't actually a gravity meter. She sighed and nodded.
Sir Ito has described the odor of Takama well enough that I wouldn't seriously consider suggesting to my citizens that we move. However, when Valhalla becomes available, we might experience a lot of emigration.
Yeah, 0.8 gravity would be a significant relief. But that's maybe 50 years away. Your children may be more satisfied with the status quo." Sir Campbell nodded without comment. We said our goodbyes and disconnected. I checked the archives and quickly found Howard's plans for the Cupid bug killers. They could be scaled down for something more the size of a wasp. I sent the plans to the printer queue with a feeling akin to relief. One more item down. 19. Cities attacked. Marcus. September 2215, Poseidon. "They've done it! They've actually gone and done it!" Vinny waved his phone like a weapon as he stomped toward me. Vinny was not physically imposing, but somehow he managed to look like an unstoppable juggernaut when in his angry marching mode. "And by it, you mean..." Cal looked up from his tablet where he'd been working on an engineering design for a new fish harvesting system. A dozen of us sat or reclined on the ring of grass that formed the periphery of the flying city of Amhor. Most residents who could manage it performed their daily duties on lawn chairs or even on blankets. The air circulation systems were very carefully designed to keep the air temps down around a comfortable spring day in our domed environment. And it helped that Fibrex didn't trap infrared like traditional glass. Life was hell, but we tried to bear up under the burden. Vinny threw himself down on the grass and tossed his phone onto a nearby side table. "The council has declared us deserters and forbidden any contact. They're confiscating any assets owned by any city resident that they can get their hands on and issued warrants for our arrest." This wasn't really unexpected. In fact, it had taken a month longer than the date I'd originally estimated. If the council had any brains at all, they'd be trying to pull the teeth of the biggest single threat to their rule, me, right about now. I checked my feeds, and sure enough, I'd been locked out of colony patrol, monitoring, defense, and infrastructure channels. Damn, that meant I would no longer be able to spend my time monitoring things for them, fixing things for them, running things for them. Boo-hoo! I grinned, and Cal looked at me quizzically. "I think I've just been fired." I shrugged at him. "Spares me the trouble of quitting, I guess."
"What are we going to do?"
asked one of the planning techs, a blonde woman named Frida. "Nothing," I replied. "I've exchanged words with the council the last couple of months. I've made it clear to them that we, and especially I, won't fire the first shot. But that if they try to get their way by violence or war, they'd have the entire Bobiverse to deal with. So I don't actually expect any shooting, just legal maneuvering and threats." "And economic sanctions. They've cut off all trade, all contact." Cal shrugged at me.
"What exactly are they cutting us off from, Cal?"
Dinu leaned back on an elbow and glared at Cal with an eyebrow arched.
"We have a third of the planet's population, but we produce half the food calories. Most of the technical people transferred to the cities in the first month. Manufacturing is off-planet, so we have as good access to it as they do."
"That may not be entirely true," I said. Everyone looked at me. I shrugged. "I've been checking statuses as we've been talking. The council seems to have managed to garrison all the materials stocks in the Lagrange points." I tried to wave up an image, then remembered that I wasn't in VR. Instead, I sent a feed to any tablets in our group. I guess it explains why they were so slow to act. They were taking the extra time to get into position. My drones are showing council security forces occupying strategic locations around the stockpiles. And, I added, shaking my head, looks like they've laid claim to the Lagrange auto factories as well. "Are the Bobs going to take that lying down?" Cal glared at me. I chuckled in response. "Well, the Bobs consists of me in this system, so not very much of a threat. I have shipbusters, but they're only useful in a full-scale engagement. I've got some roamers, but I wouldn't want to sacrifice them in a guerrilla war. I have my printers, but it would take time to set up a full auto factory, and more time to get mining going again." "So, we're dead in the water?" "For the moment, as far as they know," I responded. "But they also know we'll rebuild our own resources in short order. They have to bring us to our knees before we can do so." "How?" I shrugged. "Resource interdiction, which they've already done. denial of food sources, which they incorrectly think they can do, and cutting us off from any space assets, which I'm surprised to say they haven't. At that moment, the signal from my decoy cut off. Son of a bitch, they did it! All heads turned to stare at me. I shrugged and gave them a twisted grin. They just blew me up. 20. Life. Howard, June 2219, HIP 14101. Finally. The drone flew through Odin's upper middle cloud layer, casual as you please, as if umpty-ump of its ancestors hadn't gone down in screaming flames trying to achieve this milestone. Odin was slightly smaller than Saturn, but far more meteorologically active due to being closer to its primary, all of which made a difficult environment for adapting a surge-powered drone. I watched readings carefully as the drone cruised through the atmosphere. While the chemistry wasn't actually corrosive as such, it was definitely chemically active. The multiple possibilities for exothermic reactions made me hopeful that I would find something that I might be able to call life. I had no idea if all this work would ultimately pay off, but it was certainly interesting. The view from the drone was incomparable. I could see hundreds of kilometers down through clear patches of atmosphere into the depths, where colored masses of organics formed massive, floating clouds. The layering was pretty obvious. Odin's atmosphere was heavily stratified, both latitudinally and vertically. Then I saw it, a group of dots, far ahead, seemingly flying in formation. I aimed the drone toward them. By the time I got within a couple of kilometers, I was able to resolve the targets. Giant blimps, with tentacles spread round them. There was no question they were alive. They didn't quite resemble zeppelins, and they didn't quite resemble jellyfish. And they didn't quite resemble squid. They were some weird mashup of all three. Perhaps 50 meters long, with tentacles. The exact number varied between individuals. They moved as a flock. The flock didn't react defensively to the drone, which was probably far too small to present as a threat. I circled them a dozen times, each individual following my trajectory with something that might have been an eye on a stalk. The drone's readings finally moved far enough into the red, and I had to stop and bring it back. Post-mortem examinations were still a large part of my development effort, and this one had been wildly successful. As the drone flew up to my location in orbit, I played the video records again and again. Finally, I turned off the playback and stared into space, a smile forming on my face. Bridget would love this. No biologist could possibly resist. But that's incredible! Bridget seemed to have become permanently bug-eyed as she scanned through the videos. They are absolutely alive. Are they carbon-based? DNA-based? Probably, and who knows? I grinned at her from an inset window on her tablet. I hadn't wanted to take the time to deploy Manny, so I just phoned. My God, Howard. And you have forever to study them. You could too, Bridget. Howard? Bridget gave me the stink eye. Sorry, Bridge, I know. I promised. It just slipped out. She responded with one of her patented nuclear smiles, then turned back to the videos. I would love to see them. Wish granted. I'll be right over. Bridget raised an eyebrow. Howard, you are oddly well prepared. Am I being set up? I grinned and winked at her as I disconnected. Bridget looked at the device in her hands. A light helmet-shaped frame with embedded sensors, integrated goggles, and headphones. On the coffee table in front of her lay a pair of very techie-looking gloves. And what happens when I put this stuff on? She asked, one eyebrow raised. Well, this was the state-of-the-art in video game gear just before Faith stomped on that particular industry. Full immersion VR, or the 21st century version of it anyway. I found the plans in the libraries and printed this up. And what happens when I put this stuff on? Bridget repeated. You get to visit me at my place and get a better look at the Odin wildlife. She nodded, slipped on the gloves, and donned the helmet. and popped into my VR. I put Manny on standby and returned to VR. I was sitting in my beach chair, grinning at her, as she's 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 grinning.